But this morning we started our potassium iodine workshop, and as an attachment to it, we're also doing the Savannah River testing, which is being presented by Wong this morning. So we have a twofold meeting this morning, and we just wish that everyone, and first of all, let me say thank you for staying and working with us through our getting started this morning. We realize that there are things called glitches, and we just happen to fall into one, but I'm a strong believer. Nothing takes place without the presence of the Lord. So it doesn't matter how we plan it, it's all in His divine will. So this meeting was divine from the beginning, so therefore I don't apologize for the time. I just say we have to make time when the time is available. And with that being said, we're going to, our regular meeting calls for our minutes, and our minutes we're going to omit this morning, and we'll go ahead with our program, since this is a potassium iodine and Savannah River site. What we will do is those that we want everyone to stay throughout the presentations, because all of it is very important. And before we can issue you the potassium iodine, I'll be handing you out a form that looks like this. And after we go through the entire program, it's not going to take all day, then you will receive a certificate stating that you have had this training, and therefore you are now equipped to dispatch or give your family members, in case of an emergency, those potassium iodine, and which is in our present this morning. They have been shipped to us, and we do have them with us this morning. However, we must go through the training before we issue them, because we don't want anyone thinking it's just a regular medication for just to take as you would any other medication. So therefore, we'll go through that. And right now, I'm going to introduce my good friend, she's the executive director of one, so I was always told to go to the head, and if the head want to introduce anybody else, then that's up to the head. Okay. So I'm going to the head. Okay. All right, that's all right?
Yes, sir.
Let's go.
I'm Becky Rafter with Georgia Women's Action for New Direction.
And, I'm going to get my shirt to do that with chill.
And I am here along with the board and staff of Georgia One, some of the board and staff of Georgia One, Bernice Johnson-Howard, who is field coordinator in Burke County, and CC Anderson, a board member out of Atlanta, and Miss Amy Laura Howard-Stevens, a longtime Georgia One member, and some other of you in the room are members and friends of the board. And we are here at the behest of Bernice and members of the community who are interested in learning more about the monitoring that's being done by the Savannah River Ecology Lab for the Savannah River site. 10 years, and we've been trying to get funding reinstated from the Department of Energy for robust, independently done monitoring on the Georgia side of the river. That was done from 1977 until funding was abruptly cut for this monitoring in 2003. So the last data that we have for the monitoring on our side of the river that was done by the Georgia Department of Environmental Protection hasn't been done for over a decade. Dr. Rhodes is here to share with us why they think that monitoring is enough. We do thank you for being here. We do thank you all for the monitoring that is being done. And we, of course, are going to see what you have to say and welcome you with love and respect. And I just want to see if anybody else, Bernice, if you wanted to say anything, or CC. And without further ado, very beloved Bernice Johnson-Howard. And thank you for being here. And Reverend Utley. Reverend Utley, thank you for welcoming us to this community meeting that is about the potassium iodine pills, potassium chloride, and we're grateful to be here to share this information with you all.
This is a very important meeting for a lot of different reasons. Number one, the potassium chloride tablet tablets or a way that we can protect our thyroid should there be an emergency at Plant Bowl. And if you look at the history of those kinds of facilities, they have big problems with those kinds of facilities. It is but by the grace of God that we live this long in their environment and not had a meltdown of sort. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other invisible agents in our soil and animals and plants that can be just as deadly. And so please pay attention to the information that's being presented. Please take notes and write down any questions that you have for Dr. Rhodes, because he is our source of information. And as Reverend Parker said, you know, one of the reasons we're here is for wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. This is our first step. The information we find out today is going to determine where we go and what the next step is. So please ask questions. I have a lot of them of my own. If there's anything you don't understand, ask. It's new information for all of us. So please ask. If you don't know what cesium is, ask, what is it? How does it get in the body? How long does it stay in the body? What does it take to get it out of the body? Because some of the information he's going to tell you is that there are trace elements of these chemicals in our environment. But if you're getting a trace of it every day, how does your body ever have a chance to get rid of it? So please pay attention to this presentation. Write down your questions and please ask, because you might think to ask something that I don't think to ask. And whatever information you glean from this is information for all of us. So please pay attention. Please write your questions down and please ask them. And please, on your way out, sign the sign-out sheet to show that you were here today. Thank you.
I have a question. What is it potassium iodide or potassium chloride?
That's going to be the second
like day and night. I know, I heard one say potassium iodine, one say potassium chloride. And those are two totally
The iodine is different, but we're going to be talking about, he's going to be addressing us regarding monitoring the soil we grow our vegetables in, the animals we eat. Because some of the deer have been tested, and they do have some of these chemicals in them. So we want to know what's in the water we drink, the soil we're growing our plants in, and the animals that we eat, including deer and fish.
The communications plan, we recommended a report to the DOE. And they called me and asked me, since we did the report, they called and asked me whether or not I could come talk to you about it. So as I go through this, I'll sort of give you the background as to what was done, what request was made to the CAB, to DOE, what request DOE made to us, and what we did about that, and how we handled it, what our conclusions were. Before I do that, let me tell you a little bit about the Savannah River Ecology Lab. It's interesting, I've been back, I'm from Greenwood, South Carolina. I don't know if y'all know where that is. That's not too far, a couple hours from here. And my background is in wildlife ecology and genetics. I was a faculty member at Purdue University for 15 years. I left there, went out to Fort Collins for a couple of years, and I came here 3 years ago to take over as the director of the Savannah River Ecology Lab. Early on in the early 1980s, I was a graduate student out at Savannah River Ecology Lab. I did my master's out there on white-tailed deer, reproduction and genetics. And then I came back in the early 90s and did a postdoc there and worked on a variety of different things, including going over to Chernobyl and doing sampling of fish and radionuclides in fish at that time. So I went off and had my career at Purdue, worked on a variety of different things. But now that I'm back here at the Ecology Lab, sort of in my fold are a variety of different people. And just to tell you a little bit about what we do, the Ecology Lab is run by the University of Georgia. So I am a University of Georgia professor, I'm a University of Georgia employee, and all the people that work for me are University of Georgia employees. We operate on the Savannah River site under a cooperative agreement with the Department of Energy, which basically means that they give us space to have facilities and offices. They give us a little bit of funding to help pay for some of the general costs of running that lab, and then we're responsible to go out and find resources to do research on the site. We've been there, in one way or another, we've been there for 60 years. So way back when they first created the site and they went to build the reactors out there, a professor named Gene Odom at the University of Georgia was awarded a contract to look at the ecological effects of radiation in the environment on the Savannah River site. And it grew from there into what became the Savannah River Ecology Lab that started out as the Savannah River, I think, Radiation Ecology Lab. And so throughout the history of our lab, our mission has been research, education, and outreach. We have graduate students, we teach, we have undergraduates, we do research on the site, we have an outreach program that goes out to local K-12 communities. We talk to about 36,000 people a year and give about 400 talks a year out of my outreach program. So we do a lot of that kind of thing. But one of the things that we've always been tasked with, and it's in our mission statement, is we basically exist to be an independent observer and researcher on the ecological impacts of the emissions on the Savannah River site. So our purpose is to basically go out and look at what happens at the Savannah River site from an ecological perspective and go out and publish on that and report on that. And we've been doing that for 60 years. We've published over almost 34,000 scientific papers. 3,400, sorry, 34,000 big. About 3,400 scientific papers on that topic alone. Variety of different things, the ecology of the site, radiation ecology of the site, ecotoxicology, metals. We did a lot of work at coal fly ash and because of the coal fire power plants they had. We look at impacts on birds, fish, mammals, tremendously diverse research program. So in my group, I have people that do biogeochemistry, which is basically just looking at how soils, water, and metals and contaminants interact. And so if something goes into the soil, where does it go? All right, where does it stay? Does it get bound? We look at whether that becomes bioavailable again. In other words, does that actually come out of the soil and get back into plants and animals at some point in the cycle? We look at fish, we look at metals in fish, we look at radionuclides in fish. We look at a variety of different terrestrial animals. I've got folks right now working on squirrels and alligators and deer and hogs, ducks, a variety of different organisms, all of which are game species. So we're asking questions about whether there are metals being accumulated in those animals or whether there are radionuclides being accumulated in those animals. Back in the 90s, some of our scientists at the Savannah River Ecology Lab grew almost 100 different crop types on soils that were contaminated with cesium, asking questions about how much of that cesium moved out of the soil into the plants, so that they could publish information that could be used by the public and by the scientific community as to whether or not there were acceptable risks or acceptable or unacceptable levels of transfer in the soil types we have in the region. So the bottom line is that the laboratory that I work at has a variety of different people with a variety of different sets of expertise, and that's primarily the reason we were asked to do this review. Because ever since I got to the ecology lab, my mantra or my recurring theme has been that one of our mission on the Savannah River site. You've got people out there whose mission is to get rid of nuclear waste. You've got people whose mission out there is to build a box facility. You've got people out there whose mission is to run the site, right? And provide the power and the water. Our mission is to be an independent source of technical expertise, okay? And because I'm a university employee and because we are not restricted in any way on what we can publish based on the research we do on the site, we are that independent entity, okay? So they came to us and they said, will you look at our monitoring program? I'll work through this so you can see. So the charge to us, by DOE was basically to provide a recommendation on whether there's fact-based evidence to support the request for conducting additional radiological monitoring on basically the Georgia side of the SRS, and based on that recommendation, provide DOE with a recommendation on potential options that could be undertaken by them to address concerns of the CAB and the citizens of Georgia in regard to that issue. So the Citizens Advisory Board issued a recommendation 317. I don't work for DOE, basically I work for the University of Georgia. So DOE took this and said, okay, we've been asked to reconsider reestablishing monitoring on the Georgia side of the river. They came to us and they said, will you look at this issue, will you look at our program and tell us whether or not we think, or you think, from your technical perspective, this is a reasonable case. So those are the two things we were asked to do. So why us? One is that we've been working on the site since 1954. We're very familiar with the site. We're familiar with the subject matter, and therefore the technical review fell within our scope of expertise. All right. We work for the University of Georgia, and because of that, we're not a contractor on the site. DOE does not pay my salary. I get paid by the University of Georgia. But basically, the bottom line is we work under a cooperative agreement. So the whole idea is we are partners with that site to provide that independent evaluation mission. And SRL's mission, as I said, this is our mission statement, provide the public with an independent evaluation of the ecological effects of SSRS operations on the environment, which is well suited to the type of review that they're requesting us to do. So I actually was very pleased that they came to us, because ever since I got back to South Carolina, I have been telling the site that one of the things you're not utilizing us for is that independent source of information. We can go do all the research and publish all the papers that we want to, but you need to use us to actually look at issues that occur on that site and ask for our professional opinion about it. And this is one of the first examples of how they did that. So the approach, I'll just run through these. So when handed this job, this is what I did. I assigned a team of subject matter experts. I took some of the people from my research group, and I took people from various areas. I brought them together and said, we're going to do this. I identified the monitoring program elements to be evaluated. So we don't run the monitoring program. The monitoring program has absolutely nothing to do with it. Basically, the Savannah River Nuclear Solutions, which is a contractor to the Department of Energy, runs the monitoring program that occurs on the Savannah River site. So we came in independently of them and looked at what they did and how they asked their questions and how they sampled. So we identified what parts of the monitoring program we really wanted to look at to answer these questions we've been given by DOE. We developed a structured framework for evaluating those program elements. In other words, we tried to do this in a very structured way so that we covered all our bases and asked the questions that really made sense to ask. We reviewed the elements of the monitoring program. We went through and met and looked at these things, looked at how we were evaluating, compared notes. I had different subject matter experts that were looking at different pieces, and we compared notes among them because all of these things in a monitoring program are linked. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute so you understand what I'm talking about. And then we produced a final report with summary conclusions and recommendations that we gave to DOE, and DOE then was responsible to respond to the CAB. Our job was done. Our job was to take their data, look at it, and give them our best technical opinion of what was going on. So the resource materials we used for this, I'll run through this quickly. We've had a copy of one. They have environmental site reports that Savannah River Nuclear Solutions gives to DOE every year. It's basically a complete summary of their monitoring program, how they calculated things, and basically what they found. We looked at those for the last several years, and they fund the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control to actually run a monitoring program on the South Carolina side, and they have for a long time. So we thought it would be valuable to look at that because, here, in my opinion, one of the biggest advantages of having that South Carolina program is having another group, right? So you were talking about independent groups a minute ago. We've got another group that's actually looking at the same questions, and we looked at the data from the two programs and we compared head to head. So we wanted to know whether or not those two groups, one that's being funded and worked by a contract work on the Savannah River side, and one that's being done by South Carolina Department or DHEC, whether or not those two groups would come up with the same conclusions. And then we use a variety of other literature and reports as needed. So what do we evaluate? I'll go through these. So when we look at this, and you look at a monitoring program, a monitoring program is really designed to give you some indication whether or not, in this case, anything's moving off that site. All right? So, is it being conducted for environmental media or pathways that are important and the results of these activities? So you heard the word pathways, right? You guys have heard the word pathways used by these folks? Let me tell you what pathways, and I'll give you an example in a minute. Air, water, right? Air, water, all those things are pathways. What the word pathways means in the context of a monitoring program is how it moves from where it is to you. Okay? So the monitoring program is basically designed to look at all the potential environmental sources of radionuclides moving from that site into us off that site. Not just you, me too, I was naming it, right? So basically, we wanted to know whether they were looking at the right path. The regulatory standards used to set exposure limits. So if you look at their reports, they're going to give you a set of numbers that are going to say the exposure limits that we recommend, and they're pretty conservative. They're about a tenth of what we see nationally. So they're very low, and they say, how close are we coming to that? If a maximally exposed individual actually got exposed to all these things in the air and the water and the food, how close would they come to what we recommend to be a minimum safe dose? So we looked at that and decided whether or not we thought that was acceptable. The dose risk calculations basically take all that information, how much is moving through the pathways, how much a maximally exposed individual might get, what the limits are, and ask, is there a risk to the human population? Okay? And then the communications pathways to the public for monitoring the results. And that's part of the reason I'm here today, is that we made some recommendations, and I'll go over them at the end, that they could do a better job at how they communicate with the local communities. So we'll start with this monitoring conducted in pathways. So as I mentioned again before, the environmental media they look at is air and rain, water, surface water, drinking water, groundwater, sediment, soils, and biota. Okay? These are potential pathways that radionuclides can get into humans. All right?
Wait, what's biota?
Oh, living organisms, sorry, my fault. Well, biota are animals, basically, and plants. So I'll just break it down. In biota, they go in and they take crops out of gardens and they sample. They go in and they actually take samples of dairy milk. They take samples of a variety of things, some wild game and domestic production animals, as well as production crops that you might find on your table from the local community. So basically, if you look at that list, those are the ways that have been identified where a radionuclide could get from where it resides on the Savannah River site out into the community. And they look at each one of those and they set up a monitoring program to figure out how much, when, and where. And if y'all have questions as we go, just feel free to stop. Okay, so what do we do for each one of those items on the list? We did the following things. So, if you're going to look at what might be moving through the air or water, I want to know what the potential source of the contaminants from the SRS in that pathway is. So we actually summarized what kinds of radioactivity sources are there on the Savannah River site, and then how they related to those pathways. What might be in the air, what might be in the water, what might be moving in the groundwater, what might be in a wall down, those type things. Spatial and temporal extent of sampling. So monitoring programs are really made or broken by how often you do it and where you do it, right? So we had to look at how they conducted their monitoring program in terms of how frequently they sampled relative to those potential sources, where it's coming from, and where they sampled. And we asked the question, do we feel that that is sufficient to give us good data on whether things move off that site or not? So and my folks are scientists, and this is what they love to do, right? They love to look at these kinds of questions. And the extent of the SRS environmental surveillance program is compared to South Carolina's. So for every time we went through and looked at these things, we compared the data from South Carolina's program to DOE's program. And the reason we did that, yes?
I'm just going to ask you, when they look at these things, what's the circumference or radius of the space that they're looking at?
For most of these things, for most of these things, particularly air and water, things that could go in any direction, they have the entire circumference. Between the monitoring program that DOE conducts, plus what South Carolina's conducting, of course, you got it all. But DOE alone does, I don't know if you recognize it, I won't go into those details. They're in the full report, but DOE samples multiple wells and multiple sources of various contaminants in those pathways on this side of the river.
From, like, is it so many miles from?
A lot of them are spatially done, that's right.
It might be different. I guess I was trying to figure out, here's the building, here's the source.
Right.
So does it go out, 50 miles from?
Some of them, I mean, so for example, I'll give you an example. So when they look at the Savannah River and the water in the Savannah River, they have sampling stations in Savannah as well as upstream and downstream. So based on what's likely to occur, in other words, how that might move, dictates how far away they sample and how many samples they take.
And where can I find that data?
Those data are all in the SRS environmental report, so you can go to the site's website and they'll have the latest one will be the 2013 environmental monitoring report. So you've got a copy of an old one there, I think. Yeah. So this is, every year they do this environmental monitoring report. This is from 2002. They do one every year. So all of the details of how they monitor and what they find are in here. And they put one out on their website every year. Now,
When was it? 2014.
it'll probably be available this summer. They basically give them, after the end of the calendar year, the contract with the SRNS has a fixed amount of time.
And I'm just going to ask that you hold your questions until the end of his presentation, because we want to make sure we get through all of his presentation.
Okay. All right. So the last is we do our overall conclusions. Once we looked at all this, we make conclusions based on whether or not we thought the program was sufficient to capture the information about whether radionuclides move off the site or not, and then basically recommendations for improvement. So anywhere along the way, if we saw where we could make recommendations we thought would improve the program, we made it. So our overall conclusions, and I'll just jump right into that. The most likely pathways for movement of radionuclides in local communities, which are the air, rainwater, and surface water, those are the primaries. Right? When you look at the site and what's likely to move, those are the primaries. They're monitored both spatially and temporally, and their coverage of the pathways in Georgia by existing programs we thought were adequate. Because basically, if you look at the data, if you look at how much actually moves over the last multiple years, and how well they capture that information, spatially and temporally, they do a pretty good job with the air, rainwater, and surface water. So, for example, and I'll go through these a little bit as we go, but say air. They have air monitoring stations associated with a variety, I think, of the groundwater wells, for example. They have multiple groundwater wells, and that was the one that they're most interested in, because if you think about groundwater on the site, there are many areas where there are contaminants in the groundwater because of the way they constructed storage facilities 50 years ago. Okay? And even though those leaks are fairly minor, there are leaks there. So the question is, how's that groundwater going to move? Is it going to move under the Savannah River? And if it does, is it going to show up, and how are we going to find it? So their solutions are wells, and they do lots of them. They have lots of them on the site, they have lots of them on the periphery, and they have lots on the Georgia side, as well as the South Carolina side. The one thing we found out, and I'll talk about this later, but it was very interesting to me. One of the things we found out is the U.S. Geological Survey did a study on groundwater movement. And they asked the question, can groundwater move under the Savannah River to this side? The answer to the question is yes, but very, very low probability of it happening. It's a flow that's not going to happen very swiftly. You could be talking hundreds of years. And it's counter-current on the other side as you've got water pressure coming from the Georgia side pushing back against that groundwater. So basically, if we had massive droughts or we had massive changes in hydrology, those wells potentially could pick something up, but it's pretty unlikely. Okay? So we felt like at least it was monitored very well, so that if there was ever anything picked up, they'd find it pretty quick. So again, movement of radionuclides into Georgia by groundwater is not considered to be a likely scenario unless you saw massive changes in water regimes here. Now you can have short droughts, you can have flooding years with lots of rain. I'm talking about a decade of change, in massive change in water input to the groundwater before you might actually see anything going on here. So we felt that at least in terms of their monitoring program, they're doing a good job, and that they know their early warning. You have to think of a monitoring program as an early warning system. It's basically looking at all these various pathways, and it's monitoring it to see whether or not there's anything moving through it, and if it is, whether it's harmful. And in this case, it's not. The other one that I was very interested in was the movement of radionuclides into Georgia by accumulation by, so in other words, plants and animals, is not considered a likely scenario without significant changes in contaminant transfer with other pathways like air, rainwater, surface water, or groundwater. So think about it. I mean, so I grew up on a small farm in South Carolina, okay? And so I look at this and I say, what does that really mean? That means that if it's going to show up over here in a deer or a hog or my dairy cow, it's probably going to come in the rain, right? Or the air. Because my dairy cow not spending any time on this side of the river, right? And my dairy and my deer is probably not swimming across this river. So if you just look at it from a practical standpoint, you get some species that are capable of moving back and forth across that river, but if they are, it's really rare. So anything that's on the Savannah River side that might have that, it's probably not going to just move. But if you really want to look at what might move across, if it's going to get it on this side of the river, it's probably going to come from the air, rainwater, surface water, or groundwater. So the question is, what's the likelihood of radionuclides in wildlife on this side? Has all to do with those other pathways, the air, the water, and the surface of groundwater. Because that's where those deer or those hogs or those rabbits or squirrels are going to get, right? So the bottom line is, from a biological standpoint, if you're monitoring those pathways, the air, the rainwater, surface water, or groundwater really well, then you know long before anything happens over here with wildlife or plants that something's about to happen. Does that make sense? Am I making sense there? Because you think about it that way. An organism over here, be it a cow, be it a domestic production animal, or be it a wildlife species, it's going to get anything that came from here, from the Savannah River side, by eating vegetation or other animals. And where they're going to get it, drinking water, they're going to get it from these pathways. So based on our conclusions, we came back to them and said we didn't find evidence that establishing another monitoring program was all that useful, because we felt that the monitoring program they have right now does what it's supposed to do. It tells us what's moving, and there is not much moving. And it tells us when it moves and how it moves. Okay? And that was what we were tasked to do, is tell them whether or not we thought that their program did that, and it did. And we think it was adequate, basically, to give us the information we need to respond to whether or not there are upticks or downticks in the movement of radionuclides. But we did make some recommendations. All right? And by the way, I'm giving you a summary that has a lot of information in it, but the full report's on our website, which is www.srel.edu. So we posted the full report there, and it goes into a lot more detail. Yes, ma'am.
I was just looking to read that, said a few, what is that word, the big, the SPARKL, and temporary extent of monitoring programs currently conducted or funded by DOS.
Caveats, okay. Yeah, with a few caveats. What I meant with a few recommendations, with a few instances where we made recommendations, and I'll show them to you.
Okay.
Yeah, with a few caveats. So what I mean by that is basically we did find some things we thought they could do better.
Oh, okay.
All right. And so we looked at it, and I'll show you some of those. So let's look at rainwater and air, okay? So the recommendations there were, we thought because of the importance of the validation that South Carolina's program gives them, they should co-locate some of their wells between DHEC and DOESR, because that's an important goal of that monitoring program in South Carolina, is to validate whether or not the DOE program is doing its job. And I will tell you, when we looked at the data all the way through, the South Carolina data and the DOE data, they weren't exactly the same, but they were really close. So that gave us a lot of confidence that the DOE program that's being run by SRNS was doing a good job, because we could validate it through the independent data coming from South Carolina. So the bottom line there is we didn't find any reason to believe that because if they were doing, if any one of them was doing something that wasn't right, those data shouldn't agree. Right? But they did agree.
Actually, this is a heavy agriculture area. You talk about rainwater, ash water, but what aquifer does SRS and Vogel sit on?
Well, there's multiple aquifers under there. There's like 16, I think.
Okay, so what testing was done?
They have multiple wells with multiple depths.
Okay, I know what will. No, agriculture, because these farmers pull a lot of water with these pivots
Right.
that these
I
crops.
can't tell you the exact places they do it, but they do go out and do it for local farmers markets. They do it for local landowners. They sample a variety of agricultural plants on the Georgia side and the South Carolina side. They will tell you exactly in that report. If you go to their report that they publish on the
Oh,
website.
I read it because we have a plant that was in Louisville. It's called Thermo King.
Okay.
And it's right next door to my mama's house.
Yep.
And it was, you've seen the thing, it was leaking the same stuff, but they tried to tell us that because there was a branch running in between it, that there was no possible problem with that. But my grandmother died from cancer, and 2 years later, the plant was shut down because they drilled a number of wells. And the wells aren't going to give you what you want from the wells. A 10-foot well is going to give you a different reading from a 40-foot well or a 100-foot well.
That's right.
Because of what you're looking for. So my thing is, getting back to this, what about the agricultural side? Because these crops grow from that water, and that water is into the seed, and the seed might be sold in Canada, Germany, anywhere in the world.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to answer your question exactly, but I'm going to give you my best shot, okay? Because it's their monitoring program, and we looked at it. And so, number one, we did look at the distribution of well depths, and they have a good distribution of well depths that should catch multiple aquifers. So that the groundwater problem should be pretty well monitored. But the other one is that if you look at all the models that they run, trying to figure out what groundwater moves on the Savannah River this side, very little, if any, water is moving. So I mean, and I was being realistic. You could be talking about hundreds of years for water on South Carolina side to move under, right, to the Georgia side, because of the way those aquifers are constructed and sort of stacked, and the other is because of positive pressure on the other side. So basically, if you look at the Georgia side, all that water's flowing to the Savannah River side on that side too. So in fact, Flowery Gap was identified in the report, and we talk about the report in that report we put on our site. So you can actually go get the original report. And it talks about that being the most likely place for any water to move up if it ever does. Yes, ma'am.
I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
When we originally went to the CAB, what we asked the CAB was for monitoring on the Georgia side because of plant folding. I mean, it's good to know that SRS
Right.
may not be doing a lot of pollution on this side, but our request was because Plant Vogel sits in our backyard.
Right.
So if agents at SRS, which the report shows that they have, can move from SRS all the way to Burke County, then certainly Plant Vogel, 10
Right.
miles away,
Right.
can pollute our environment.
Well, I don't disagree with that,
Okay.
but so let me just give you my personal opinion on that, okay? So the CAB is a Citizens Advisory Board for DOE.
Right?
They can't make Vogel do anything. So, and they can't make, I mean, I'm trying to figure out where your question's coming from.
My question is this, if we have a concern because if agents at Savannah Riverside, Radiological,
Right.
can migrate from Savannah Riverside then certainly agents from Plant Vogtle
I agree.
can infiltrate too. So that's why we're fighting for monitoring in Georgia because of Plant Vogtle and not necessarily because of Savannah Riverside. But looking at this survey that I have, the 213 version of it, it says that there were 400 and something samples done in Georgia by Savannah Riverside. Of those 472 samples that were done in Georgia, how many of those samples were done in Burke County?
I don't do that, we don't know that.
How can we, because 472.
Oh, you know, actually,
samples.
okay, there's two, so I understand your question, there's two ways I think. We complained about that too, because when we went through there, it was hard. The data, there's a disc on the back, right? In the back.
Right.
So we asked them in our report to make those data, those kind of data you're asking for, more transparent. I said, because we had the same problem. We could read it, we could look at it, and we could pull the data out, but we sometimes didn't know where exactly these things happen. So we finally figured it out, but it took us a while. So one of the things that we recommended, and I think it may even be in here, is that they take and make that data more easily available so people know exactly where you're talking about. So yes, ma'am.
Did you?
No, that was what I.
So, related to Maurice's question is what, I'm just curious why, I understand why you measured, why you look at the data that South Carolina DHAC and SRS did to make sure that it's similar.
Right.
I'm wondering why, or if you're, and I guess this isn't going to happen again, unless, the cabinet took the recommendation, but the data that was done in Georgia by the EPD
Right.
in 2002, we had a graduate student comparing the data that SRS did, and we found pretty large, in some places, some pretty large discrepancies. And what's happening is that this community is downwind and downstream from Savannah Riverside in a way that communities in South Carolina aren't, because of the trade wind, because of the way the water is flowing, and Plant Local exacerbates that. So, I think it is important to, in addition to looking at South Carolina as a control, looking at the data in Georgia compared to Savannah Riverside State.
So two things. Okay. Two things, and I'll just say.
And I want to know who paid for this to happen and how much was people
Who is?
the study.
I didn't accept any additional money from DOE. We get some money from DOE to help on our lab. When they came to me and asked for this, I did it. I didn't ask them for any more money. All right, and I just use my people's time because I feel that this is something we should be doing because that's our role, right? We're an independent group. And so as long as I've got the people and resources to do it, and their time, I just basically, we did it. Precisely because of that reason. I didn't want to go back and ask them for money and pay for the time for all these people to do it. I felt it was something we should be doing.
And here's your question about the data.
Yeah. From the data perspective, what we looked at, and this sort of gets tied up into the vocal thing. What we looked at was specifically to determine whether or not there was adequate spatial and temporal coverage to see what was coming off the side. And we felt it was, okay? Which includes, anything moving to the Georgia side. So from our perspective, the ability to sample air, water, groundwater, surface water, all those things are in place and they function well. We didn't go back and look at the Georgia data because that I don't know exactly why they defunded Georgia for doing those things. There were a lot of problems. All right, and and anything else I say about that's conjecture because I don't know. All right, so we didn't go back and look at those data because it seemed irrelevant to the question we were looking at right now, and that is whether or not what's coming off that site is monitored properly. That was it. Now, Vogel's a different beast, and I don't know that we can expect DOE to monitor. I know Vogel does monitoring, but I don't know, and we almost went to look for those data, but we decided not to because that's not what we were asked to do. But Vogel, as a part of its nuclear regulatory requirements, has to do some monitoring.
Right. But with all due respect,
Yeah.
Vogel is independently monitored, like you said, by the
Right.
NRC.
Right.
If you're trying to look at whether or not a program of monitoring in Georgia
Right.
by the SRS is adequate,
Right.
why would you look at what's happening in South Carolina when there are 2 programs already doing that, instead of looking at the numbers of Georgia? That is what we need to see, is whether or not the adequacy, if it's relevant in Georgia. And so I don't understand why your team, I understand
Well,
what you said.
because we looked at the last 3 or 4 years, right? Right?
But the last 3 or 4 years was 2002. It was 2002.
Oh,
The Georgia Department.
For Georgia.
Yeah, I have your report right here, 2002.
Only reason we looked at South Carolina was to determine whether or not it validated the data from SRS.
But the question wasn't about, I hear that. But the Georgia data is what we're concerned with. And the Georgia data, although similar in a lot of ways to SRS a decade ago,
Right.
there are discrepancies. And so
I've seen
I-
some of those reports and some of those discrepancies, and that's because some of those data are reported in inflammatory ways.
Wait, what do you mean?
What
Data
they
was
were-
reported in inflammatory ways. So scientists are scientists.
Not just the ones I've seen in the report from EPD. That's all I know about. Yes.
How is it inflammatory if you're going by a scientific measurement?
Well, there are lots of ways to report data,
Exactly, and that's the problem. as
which
we're
is why
counting
we looked at South Carolina and the Savannah Riverside. We took 2 groups that were independently monitoring the same thing and asked the question, because that's what we're asked to do: is their data reliable and is it sufficient? And so South Carolina only served the purpose for us of making the point that the data is consistent. That's what we're doing. Now, you're asking me whether or not we need an additional monitoring program in Georgia, and based on what we see in the Savannah Riverside and how they monitor, I don't see any value added of having additional monitoring in Georgia, because it's not going to add a lot that we already, it's not going to add much that we don't already have with the current program. That's the conclusion we came to. Now, yes, ma'am.
You're a researcher.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm a researcher. You work for UGA, you live in South Carolina, but you work for UGA, which we don't even, you see, we don't want to be the next.
Yes, ma'am. That's okay. It's even before.
But my point, and our point being is, this area from Augusta down,
Yes, ma'am.
Savannah, we need independent studies, independent data research, and you're working for UGA. I don't want the biasness, but we need somebody to come in and monitor and tell us the correct results. But see, you living in South Carolina working for UGA is a conflict of biases.
I don't think it is, but let me tell you what I like that. So let me tell you what we suggest. I'll just jump to this, because the rest of it is just, you can see in the report that I just gave you. Okay, 5 minutes time. So here's what we recommend in communication, all right? So basically, if you look at these reports, they do their best, right? Yeah, you look at those big reports, we look at those big reports. They do their best, but it's a technical subject matter. And so it's largely technical in nature, assumes that the people that are reading it have the ability to understand and speak that language, which sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't, and basically draw conclusions. I think they require more than just that environmental report, right? And so it's likely that a lot of that's most useful to regulatory agencies, right, and technically trained audiences. So those groups love that report because they have people that are trained in that area, they understand it, they figure out what's going on.
But you got stakeholders here that
Okay, but for those lacking a scientific background, okay, I'm headed in the same direction you are, okay? And training and interpretation of the data, much of the material regarding those outcomes is difficult to understand, and for that reason, considering the concerns of local community members about radiological risks, we recommend the following actions be taken by DOE. Okay, the first is I think they have to consider developing a strategy of communication with local community audiences that incorporates a limited amount of monitoring data from those communities, okay, as a basis for providing outreach and education on radiological monitoring and data interpretation that can help residents draw their own conclusions. So what do I mean by that? What I thought, when we put this together, is that if you, and you may agree with me, you may not, it's completely okay, but I think that if you come into a community and you sample, we don't have to do a massive monitoring program. Well, we can do targeted monitoring in various areas. Right? We can sample from local gardens. We can sample from local wells. We can take some data and then take those data from that local community and show people what it actually means and how it relates back to what you see from Savannah Riverside in that report. I don't have to teach you to be a radiochemist, right? I don't have to teach you to be a nuclear engineer. What I have to teach you is the relationship between what they're taking in this community and what those numbers mean. So my perspective is that that's the level of outreach in the community they need. And they can't do it without local community members and leaders. Right? I can't come into your community and figure out who I need to be talking to and where. It's just like being invited to speak today. That gives me the ability to come in and talk to local, engaged community members about something I think is important. But if we're going to develop an outreach program that's going to help you understand this, we've got to do the same thing. There's going to be local churches, there's going to be local community events, it's going to be, and you've got to develop a program. I can't come in, I'll borrow your prop again, okay? I can't come in, this isn't mine, right? I don't produce this. This is the site's. This is the contractor. I can't come in and when you ask me a question, go, there it is, and do that. If I do that, then I'm lost.
I
Okay?
just got to ask you now, I know your time is limited, but we all know that very few people trust the government.
Yeah.
All right, Savannah Riverside is the government.
That's right.
Georgia Power is basically the government, it's under the government. So how do you expect people to believe what you say when, like the cab? The cab is paid for by the Department of Energy. Everybody on that board draws a salary, draws some money from the Department of Energy. Everybody that comes to the cab meeting work for SRS or the government. So how do you expect these people to believe that you won't say anything bad about the man that's paying you and you won't keep your job? And I know you get grants from Georgia, and I know your grants have to fall within certain parameters, because if they say too much bad about it, your grant cut off and you ain't getting more money. So how do these people going to know what the hell is the truth when the man working for the government?
Let me say two things. I like your enthusiasm, but let me say two things. All right. Number one.
Last two.
Oh, come on. Let me say something.
They got part of this program, Radiological, so gracious as to give us.
All right. Let me finish this and I'll answer your question. So, the second part is to utilize local community leaders to do what I just said we should do. Limit the collection of the data. In other words, don't create another redundant monitoring program because I don't think we need it. The data doesn't support the fact that we need it. If you look at what they're doing on the Savannah Riverside, there's many early warning systems in place. But if you take this data from the local community and I use it to teach, then I think we can be successful in the local community. And the last is, if we do that successfully here, I think we can do it anywhere. So developing it here and figuring out how it works. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, right? I mean, I taught at a university for 15 years. I never taught the same stuff twice the same way. Because every time I taught it, I learned something. All right? So the bottom line is, if we want to do this, I propose that a community like this is the place to do it and to figure out how to make it work. And that's what I told you. So we'll see what they decide. But
The monitoring on the South Carolina side, am I right? Are there funding for Padel's and Alabama on the South Carolina side?
Yes.
Yes, there is. Do you get it on Georgia side? No, you don't. Well, did the law stop at the river?
No, shouldn't have.
But that's why we're bringing this program to it, and Mr. Runapar, would you pass out that last sheet that Diane? Now, the one without me, it's still on the table. It's still on the table. All of this information we bring to the community on a month-to-month basis. And some of the board members are sitting right in that area there. They are. And we invite you to come and find out the information that we're covering. And let me just give you an idea about the hotels in Alabama that we're speaking about. Since it was not being given on the Georgia side, and it is not, let me tell you, if you go to Plant Boulevard and NRC, it is recommended, but it's not mandatory for them to give it to you. So therefore, anything is not mandatory, they don't really get money for it. And we all realize that it's our dollars that are building Plant Boulevard. And I was in South Georgia, and it's years back, and a lady asked me, she's deceased now, God bless her dead, and she said, I'm trying to figure out what is all this increase on my life? And I said, you actually building a plant that's in my neighborhood. She said, well, what I got to do with your neighborhood? I said, you're building a plant that's called Plant Local, and you're going to pay for it. And that's the thing that our legislators, they did this to us. And when I look at it, and I told one legislator the other day, it was discussing the water runoff in the parking lot in the churches and in the fees. And I asked him, I said, well, why are y'all getting so upset about that fee? You didn't argue when they charged you for building a plant. At least you're going to get some clean sewage and some new pipelines for this. So you have to watch what you're arguing about, my bottom. So therefore, when we thought about that, from the Sheriff Bluff group, that the meeting that we're passing around now, that this is something that's worthwhile for the community in a 10-mile radius. And therefore, we picked it up as a charge for the concerned citizens and Richard Kolkoff, who is, let me tell you a little bit about some of our board members. Richard Kolkoff is one that works with us. He's an ex-commissioner at Richmond County, and he's also a vet who works with chemicals. So they talk a lot of stuff about chemicals, and they think they're part of the billion and all of that stuff. You got to let them proper, very quickly. So we're going into these meetings, but we are not going in their blind side, because we have been working with this for quite some time, and we're quite equipped with knowing what they're talking about. So when you talk about partial billing, one thing our speaker failed to tell you this morning, all federal studies are based on the white man and his structure, not the white woman, not any black or anyone else. And they're not putting it out as a racial thing. I'm putting it out, that's how the study is done. But you have to learn that that's how the study is made up. The studies are geared to those who write them. Somebody brought it up about the idea of what you find. Whenever you do a presentation, whenever you do a study, you have a thesis and you have a hypothesis. You got an idea what you want to find. I can always make my product come out of the beat without projecting things. You can't make it be right, but I can make it be right. So it's the idea that we need to know how to balance these things that appear to be right, but are absolutely wrong. And when you talk about the aquifer, we already know that aquifer, but do you realize that Plant Bowl draws from the aquifer? They draw millions of waters and gallons of water out of the aquifer, the most purest water that is on God's earth.
69 to 75 million gallons a day. And when the two new ones go online, it's going to double that. So we're going to take
that one plant draws enough water that the citizens in Atlanta, Macon, Savannah, all together use in their whole cities, they use in one day. That's the amount of water that you're looking at. And therefore, yes, we are concerned about it. And radiation is the reason why we're talking. I don't want to give you all of that background, but I needed to bring you up to par to how we got to potassium iodide. And when we thought about potassium iodide, it's not given just like in South Carolina. It's not given in South Carolina. I mean, it's given in South Carolina, but it's not in Georgia. Potassium is given in South Carolina, but not in Georgia. But they'll find out, and a lot of people say, well, who made y'all a medical doctor? We are not medical doctors, and I don't profess to be one. But I got a little CS. A little common sense. So I know that, and what our study showed us is that when the thyroid in the very top of the one that's stapled together, you'll find a statement something like this, that you will find that the thyroid gland is that gland which gives provides for the body that the energy and on that really that one that's stapled together at the very top. There's one from it talks about the function of the thyroid gland. And the one that's stated. And it tells us that in the thyroid gland, the thyroid is one of those organs that we have. It knows pain or salt. It knows it. So, but it takes it in and it absorbs it. So in the case that he kept, and then the young man, he called it radioactive neutrons, a radioactive product. Radioactive is radioactive. But if there's so much in the air or so much in the space in which you breathe, these glands suck it in. They don't care whether it's salt, all they know is that they want it. And when they draw it in, and it stays in, and you find out, I'm paraphrasing that first statement there, it begins to use it. So if there's a radioactive or there is a radio release, and I didn't know when I was born, but I used to hear the sound standing high part of, I always said, Mr. Miller, I'm going to go to lunch. Because I knew that was our neighbor, and I let myself go on. They didn't never tell us in Hyde Park that was a radioactive release coming in Hyde Park. I learned it when I started studying about the environment. That's really what they were doing. They were killing them. So therefore, when the thyroid, and if you hear that, you plan, oh, I can't have some whistles or blowers or whatever they have. And I noticed when I came in a couple of months back, they put a sign up here, box.
I see.
That was because Reverend Parker and some of us, and Eagle State, we went to them. And we told them, say, you know, how do people know how to evacuate? We got a plan. Where's your plan? We got a plan. Where's your plan? And immediately after that, we started seeing signs pop up. Because our next move, and I'll tell you all, that we're getting ready to put a massive relocation plan. I mean, not relocation, I'm so working with Hyde Park. And I have to keep going back to relocation. Hyde Park is in relocation. But we're getting ready to do an emergency evacuation plan. And we're asking all of the MSs, right? Those who work in the release from Plant Vogel, they know we're working on it. And also, I talked last Saturday with Captain James with Richmond Council. We need all of the, and Tucker from Columbia County, and the EM people here to put the plan together. And we looked at it, and your group, Warren, we looked at it. I don't care if you got a PhD, you couldn't figure it out. When I looked at it, my goodness, we sat in the library in Burke County, and we couldn't tell from this church which way to go. Because for the most part, it was written too small. It was not color-coded according to where, anything that a child would really say, well, put those thyroids that color so they'll stand out. Well, nothing to tell me that color represents the thyroid. Nothing to tell you that color represents how it's 23 or 7 gold or whatever. So how would you know where to go to get it? So that's another thing that we're doing. But like I say, with the thyroid, if there is a release of a radioactive in the area, and you get a notice that there's been a release, you need to protect those glands. Because what they're going to do, they're going to take it in. And from there, it stays there, and it develops into thyroid cancer. And that's why you see some people have real look like, that's where it's coming from. It's the thyroid. But you notice, and now a lot of people were saying, I hope the young man will still be in here, because he asked a question earlier about this density. It's not a day-to-day thing you take. You don't put it with your high blood pressure medicine, whatever medicine you say, well, you can take one a day, or take it down. You only take it in case that is an emergency evacuation or an emergency meltdown. Okay? Now, if you're in that area and the siren goes off, you need to be able to have it readily available. So you notice CDC, and you notice I'm going to the one now that has the clock on it, and it'll tell you that these can be given out, and it tells you how it's to be given out. It tells you, it says the single dose of K1 potassium iodine protects the thyroid gland for 24 hours. So, in other words, you still can't sit around twiddling your fingers even if you got the thyroid treatment. You got to be on the move. That's why the evacuation plan needs to be in place. You take your potassium iodine and you get in a hurry.